Okay, hi everybody. So I will start by climate change, but basically what I'm doing more is I'm more focused on my research on biodiversity loss. So we'll also try to connect a bit the two issues and speak more generally about social environmental movements with a particular focus in the area following the 2008 financial crash. So starting from climate change and actually trying to to see a bit what is happening this last few months, especially with the school strikes and all the events that we have also in the UK, but around the globe. And there's sometimes heated discussions around the demands of these movements, the figures of the movement. I mean, I'm sure that all of you have seen many discussions the last few weeks around these issues. So starting from that, I would like to offer, start with a few quotes of, what people are saying about climate change. So the first one goes like that. It says, international leaders have 18 months to tackle climate change. If we do nothing, the consequences for every person on this earth will be severe, with vast numbers of environmental refugees and social instability, far worse than anything we are seeing today. So this has been said by Prince Charles last spring here in London. He's one of the advocates of solutions to tackle climate change, and he's also in this, same logic of emergency around climate change. And then in July 2019, we had 8 of the world's largest asset managers that decided to include climate risk in their investments. This was actually mobilized by the French president, Emmanuel Macron, who claims that he's one of the major actors fighting against climate change in Europe right now. Of course, a few months later, in response to the school climate strikes, the French government had very different things to say about climate change. So we are reading in September 2019 in the UK press, Macron again saying there are a lot of citizens' actions that are useful, but such radical positions, imagine that he refers to the speech that Greta gave to the UN, this is a very radical position, are liable to antagonize our societies. And of course, this is not what we want, because we need consensus to resolve the climate crisis. And again, a few days later, we have the finance minister of France again, saying the same day that finance will be green. So we have here, the discourse on the green economy, or it won't be. So we need finance to be green because we need an ecological transition. Otherwise, we won't survive as humanity. The same day, the same person says that, okay, President Macron and our government have done a lot on the issue, but we should be very careful with things like the climate strikes, because we don't want to create a generation of depressed people over this kind of issues. So it's interesting to see, what some people support, and at the same time, what they're against. I mean, I think it's quite, it offers a really nice clarity on what exactly they have in mind, better than, just having me here interpreting what they're saying. And I will finish with that. I will finish with Theresa May, the previous Prime Minister here. So Theresa May, in June 2019, was saying in an interview that this country, namely the UK, led the world in innovation during the Industrial Revolution. So now we are again, the UK, we must lead the world to a cleaner, greener form of growth. Standing by is not an option. And she announced, and perhaps you remember that the new goal of the government was that by 2050, we will have a net zero of carbon emissions. So Theresa May, again, speaking about the school climate strikes, and I really like these quotes, so we'll finish with that, says that, of course, everybody wants young people to be engaged in the issues that affect them most, so that we can build a brighter future for all of us. But, because there is a but, of course, it is important to emphasize that disruption increases teachers' workloads and wastes lesson time that teachers have carefully prepared for. That time is crucial for young people precisely so that they can develop into the top scientists, engineers, and advocates that we need to help tackle climate change. So I started with this because I wanted to show that beyond, this broader consensus around climate change and around the fact that we should definitely do something about the environmental crisis. Um, of course, the way that people are framing solutions are extremely different. And I think this is very important, and this is where we should start when we're trying to discuss the ecological crisis, whether it is climate change or biodiversity loss or any other issue that we want to discuss about. So this is the need for sustainability, and I'm sure you know the term, and I'm sure you know that the hegemonic discourse is focusing on sustainability, and this is the core issue around we will see mostly, almost any public debate to focus when we're talking about the environmental crisis. So this idea about sustainability is concerned actually on reducing carbon dioxide. So every discussion and every solution is around carbon dioxide. And I had many students during these last few years saying, so why people are talking about climate change and are not talking about biodiversity loss? Why people are not talking about, extinction? I mean, perhaps we're entering the sixth extinction. Why people prefer talking about climate change, and actually why people are talking, they're obsessed about carbon dioxide. Why is this? Why are we talking about this thing? Why we have, we have about this particle, and we're talking about only about this. So I would like to draw a bit here on Eric Swingendoe. Perhaps you know him. He's a professor in the University of Manchester. So Eric Swingendoe has written a lot about climate change and about post-politics and about the way that we frame our main political responses shows is, even if we're trying to frame actually our political responses as neutral or as technical or as apolitical, this is a very political stance. So he has written extensively on that, and you will find a lot of things online on his work. So I would like to draw here on what he was writing about, starting from climate change and starting from carbon dioxide, about this idea of, climate change as a universal threat for everybody, as a universal threat for humanity, or as an emergency, as what Mike Davis has termed, the ecologies of fear, so that we should all be afraid because this is coming, and this is coming for every one of us. So these ecologies of fear, yes, they are political, they're framed as apolitical, and they're usually focused on two things, either on the need for techno-managerial transformations or on the need for individual transformations of our behavior. And if you see, in most cases, the public debate will focus on these two things. Science and technology can help us, tackle climate change, resolve any issue, because we will, for example, promote geoengineering or, any other things that you can imagine. Or the other thing, please do recycle more. Go to an organic farm, which of course is good. I'm not saying the opposite, because, it's on you. If you change an individual behavior, we will resolve this crisis. So we see these two things, and this is quite important. Sometimes these two core solutions quite easily take a dystopian turn when people start talking about what Marcus was talking years ago, and mean here, overpopulation. And this is the third thing that is coming in the discussion. We are too many. Of course, not here, not in Europe, not in Britain. We are too many in Africa. We're too many in Asia. Okay, this is the third thing. And I would like to mention here some very, well-known environmentalists, starting from Sir David Attenborough. And I was working in his building in the University of Cambridge for years, the David Attenborough building. So he's a figure that everybody respects in the university that I work. And of course, all people in conservation respect him. And there's a lot to respect him about. I don't want to say the opposite, but I want to say something else. So taking this kind of very well-known environmentalist, or, James Lovelock, perhaps you know him, or Jane Goodall, these big names of good people working for the environment. All of these people are reproducing this rhetoric that I just mentioned around techno-managerial optimism and around individual behavior, and even worse, around overpopulation. The number one issue in conservation today is overpopulation. And this is what you are studying in many universities, like the University of Cambridge or top universities around the globe, when you are studying environmental and conservation politics. So going back again to Eric Swingendo's, that he draws on orange here, saying that basically the key message is that we have to change radically, but only within the limits of the existing system, so that nothing really has to change, so that everything remains the same. And this is the core idea around all this hegemonic discourse around climate change. So I'm sure that what I have prepared is for more than 20 minutes, but anyway, so I will try, maybe I will stop because the next speaker has to speak, and then we will say more later. But I really want to read this because I think it shows really well where these things can lead. I mean, it's not only, all this emphasis on the technical solutions, the individual solutions, and etc. So I'm taking something from James Lovelock here, and he says, what if at some point in the next few years we realize, as we did in 1939, that democracy had temporarily to be suspended, and we had to accept a disciplined regime that saw the UK as a legitimate but limited safe haven for civilization. Orderly survival requires an unusual degree of human understanding and leadership, and may require, as in times of war, the suspension of democratic government for the duration of the survival environmental emergency, for our survival. Huh? So, going a bit faster now, because I think I made this point quite clear about, what we're listening, what is the main thing that surrounds us, and sometimes even, it's considered radical, so we should be quite careful on how everybody frames these kind of issues. I will just go now, I will try to be brief, and I will try to address quickly some questions that I think are of major importance for a political ecology, for a radical political ecology approach to issues like climate change, biodiversity loss, and in general, the environmental crisis. So I will start by saying, that what we currently witness is not, of course, entirely new. Okay, it's just the latest stage in a long history of contradictions between capitalism and non-human nature. And what we see is the latest, developments, of course, strongly influenced by neoliberalism. And when I talk about neoliberalism, I mainly mean the new stage in capitalism starting after the crisis of 1973. And I mean, the focus and the emphasis on privatizations, on deregulations, on market-friendly re-regulations, and in general, the obsession with market-based solutions in every possible problem that we are facing. Either it has to do with environment, or with education, or with health, or with everything. So we can say a lot about this if you are interested on the story, the history behind these ideas in the case of the environment. And we have a very long history, which is extremely interesting and relevant here, around environmental markets. So one of the core solutions about, that I guess actually the most popular solution right now globally is framed around the establishment of environmental markets. This started, of course, with the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. But now we have markets for everything. We have markets for water, we have markets for biodiversity, we have markets that we can exchange different habitats. We have species banking. In this country, we have the Environment Bank. I don't know if you know the Environment Bank. You can go online and read more about the Environment Bank. The Environment Bank is an environmental broker. And what they say to advertise themselves is, as you need a broker for other things, of course, you also need a broker for the environment. So we're playing this role, and we facilitate, agreements and basically exchanges of land to offset your environmental damage. So the key idea behind environmental markets, either it is for carbon or for biodiversity, is this idea of environmental offsetting. Namely, the idea that I can destroy nature here and create an equivalent amount of nature somewhere else and exchange this kind. I mean, this is very real, and actually this is what I have been doing the last 4 years in this country, so it's happening. And this is how development is currently being offset, in most cases, in England at least. So, of course, I mean, as you can imagine, there is a very big, interesting discussion here around the consequences and the implications of this shift towards, the establishment of environmental markets that relates a lot, if we want to also think a bit in more theoretical Marxist terms, with the classical discussion around use value and exchange value. So what we see in all these cases is that exchange value becomes the main way that nature is being represented. And this is, of course, major. It has major consequences, as it has for everything else, because it doesn't happen, of course, only with nature. It happens with everything. But imagine taking non-human nature with the great variety of, the case of biodiversity, for example. I mean, even if we try to define biodiversity, it's almost impossible because, at the most basic level, biodiversity is everything that surrounds us, everything that, exists beyond humans. Okay, the non-human, I don't mean the built environment, of course. So imagine to try and describe biodiversity loss, species loss, habitats loss, climate change, carbon, in terms of priced credits, because this is what these markets are doing. And say, your environmental damage was 5 biodiversity credits, and they have this price, and you can pay this price, and that's fine. You can destroy the last piece of green land in North Tyneside, where I was working, a working class environment with a park that, people were going every day for everything you can imagine. The kids were playing there. It was basically the last green space in the whole county, destroyed for a huge housing development of luxury villas and offset in Northumbria, if I pronounce this, in a different area, saying to people as an argument that, it's fine, you can always take your car and drive 20 minutes and go to the new green area. Well, yeah, but these kind of crazy things are happening, and this is how, non-human nature is being valued right now, not only, of course, in Europe and in the US. These things are very, very, very advanced in Australia, very advanced in the US, more advanced actually than they are here. And they're rapidly developing in Asia, in Latin America, and in Africa. It's everywhere. The last time I was reading about this, we have more than 13,000 projects of this kind of offsetting I just mentioned around biodiversity. So there is this very, very important and popular. The first question, of course, was around environmental markets, and I wanted to say a few things because it's, as I said, it's the mainstream and the popular solution, and everywhere you will go, and they will be talking about the environment, the first thing you will hear is, we have to create environmental markets, or we need environmental taxes, or we need the polluter pay for the damage that they are creating. So everything is around, this idea of giving a price to nature that is being largely understood as an externality. If you are interested in economics, perhaps you will know the term. So the main idea behind this is based on neoclassical economics, and it is that, in the way that our economy is working, we don't take into account nature. It is an externality. So we have to internalize nature in our accountings, and we will do that by giving nature a price. There's an extremely interesting and important discussion. I'm coming from a Marxist background, and I'm writing on Marxist political economy. So, and there is a paper that we can distribute. It's very relevant, what published last week by me and a friend, that we're trying to explain that this kind of solutions, of course, have nothing to do. Nature will never be internalized into capitalism because you will give a price. Okay, the problem starts from the production. This talks about other things, about consumption, circulation, has nothing to do with the core contradictions of the capitalist production mode. So I'm going faster because I have no idea how much time I'm okay.
We are always out of time.
And I'm going to the second very, very, very important question about, who is to blame? Even though I'm sure that I have already given some ideas about what I have in mind, but this is a very popular issue again, and perhaps we live in the era that, this is the main thing, your lifestyle. Change the things you are doing, change what you are eating, change what you are, wearing, your house, your car, whatever, everything's around that, which, as I said, is perfectly fine. I have these concerns. I'm trying to respect this kind of, more environmentally, conscious behavior, but this is not the main issue, and we will never, and I'm quite sure on that, never resolve the environmental problems we have if all of us, change completely our behavior, because this is not the main issue. So I was reading recently something really nice from Naomi Klein. She put this really in a very nice way, and she said, so many environmental responses have just been, minor tweaks to an economy based on endless consumption. Take your electric car to the drive-through for a burger or a Coke with a paper straw. Look, of course, it's better than the alternative, but it's nowhere close to the depth of change required. I mean, of course, and we have many other examples around that. And then again, from Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, she writes again, we are stuck because the actions that would give us the best chance of stopping catastrophe and would benefit the vast majority are extremely threatening to an elite minority that will never allow these things to happen. So this is really interesting, because then after this book, I go 5 years ago, but I still have this article because I was laughing for months, so with friends. So in September 2014, The Guardian invited, I don't know if you know him, the philosopher John Gray, to respond to Naomi Klein's book that everybody was discussing at that point. And he started by saying, well, people think that Naomi Klein exaggerates. Wow, I think the opposite. The problem is bigger from what she says. She's trying to say that the problem is between capitalism and, climate. No, it's bigger than that. It has to do with humanity. Okay? So, and of course, this is not naive. I mean, he's not naive. He didn't say that because he doesn't understand that this is not actually the case. But this is a very, this is an orchestrated attempt to say that, it's all, it's our fault. We are to blame for that. And we will have, the consequences of all of that will be equally distributed to us. Of course not. This won't happen. It's not already, the opposite is happening. And I will give you some very, basic key numbers that perhaps you already know, but I think they're useful for this kind of discussion. So we know that, 10 major corporations are responsible for the 71% of the emissions created since 1970, just 100 corporations. We also know that the richest 10% of people across the globe are responsible for 49% of lifestyle consumption emissions. And we know that, we have data, we are sure about it. And of course, we know that, it's not the same for everybody, as it's not the same for everybody, if you think about health, it's not the same for everybody. So in October 2018, I don't know if anybody remembers, because there are so many events like that, but there was Hurricane Michael going through Florida. And there was a picture, a photo that became viral. So it was just one house, I don't know if you've seen that, in Mexico Beach, one house. And everybody was wondering, wow, how is it possible? How this house is over there? So the owner of the house was one of the most, the wealthiest persons in this area. And he has spent a vast amount of money, I don't remember the exact number, to build something with the best available technology, that would be able to withstand up to 400 kilometers per hour wind speed. So that's why there was only this house in Mexico Beach, in every picture, resisting the environmental catastrophe. So, of course, we are not, we don't have equal, we are not all to blame for that. Consequences and impacts are not equally distributed, and we know that for sure. And we already have very important, cases of climate refugees, and we already have societies in many nations across the globe struggling because of this kind of changes, either in climate, either in biodiversity. So I will mention here, I mean, there is an excellent article by Andreas Malm. He has written a lot about climate change. And one of his more popular articles in Jacobin, I think, he's giving 6 simple facts, as he says, to explain and convince people, based on historical data also, that, you know, we are not all implicated in this kind of environmental, in the environmental crisis that we're currently facing. So I won't mention all of these. I will just mention 4 of these. So he talks about China, and he says, that in the 21st century, emissions explosion came from China. Of course, this has nothing to do with overpopulation, like, this well-known environmentalists would say. It has nothing to do with lifestyle patterns. But it has, of course, to do with the major expansion of infrastructure in China. And this is, of course, related, this is related to foreign capital and investments that are happening there to extract surplus value from the exploitation of cheap local labor. And this is one of the main facts that we have for the 21st century. And again, we have many data that confirm that this is what is actually happening. So the other thing that is very important is the unequal consumption of energy. And I'm sure you have heard and read about it. So to give you again some very important numbers. So the 19 million inhabitants of New York State alone consume more energy than the 900 million inhabitants of sub-Saharan Africa. And of course, a single average US citizen emits more than 500 citizens of Ethiopia, Afghanistan, or Mali. So this is, if we want to talk about, overpopulation and consumption, it's better if we take a look, on what exactly is happening. The other 2 things, and I will actually finish with that. So is that he mentions in that article, is that capitalist states, especially advanced capitalist states, enlarge fossil infrastructures and build, new airports, new highways, new high-speed rail lines, like here with HS2, and the major issues are arising around that. Of course, without ever consulting their citizens. And in most cases, and this is what I want to emphasize for the end, these citizens will oppose this kind of mega projects and mega plans. And this is what is happening around the globe, especially the last decade after the 2008 financial crash, that we have a major infrastructure boom globally. So, and this is the same, and this is the fourth important issue around the oil and gas industry. So the oil and gas industry currently faces perhaps the biggest opposition that there is, opposition from communities, from, opposition to fracking and pipelines, starting, from Alberta and Ecuador to the UK and Greece. So everywhere around the globe. So I will just, unfortunately, because as you all perhaps understand, I have a daughter over there, so I forget things. I forgot to bring my book. So the last thing I want to say is about a book that we have published last year. The book it's called, and I have a slide, I don't know if we can show it. It's called The Right to Nature, and talks environmental movements. It talks about environmental movements, neoliberal natures, and environmental justice, especially after the 2008 financial crash in the context of the global economic crisis. So in this book, we take inspiration from the last thing I mentioned, the major opposition that we see to these industries around the globe. And we have 22 case studies from anywhere around, from different places around the globe, both from scholars, but also from activists. We also have people that have nothing to do with academia, and they contribute in this book, describing such cases of resistance against mining, fracking, gentrification, the housing crisis, and every possible privatizations of natural resources. So many different issues that we're facing that have been intensifying the last few years. And we have all these cases, and all this experience from these people fighting against the neoliberalization, as we tend to term it, of non-human nature. What I want to say from this, there are so many lessons that we can learn from these case studies, and of course, I don't have the time for this right now, and we can expand this further if there is an interest on that, and I can also tell you more about the book later. But what I would like to say here, and just Nico, please let me know how.
3 minutes.
Okay, 3 minutes. Okay, so
5.
So what we're trying, so we call the book, no, just this and I'm finishing. So we call the book The Right to Nature. Why we decided to say that, which is, I know, quite strange perhaps as a term. So I don't know if you're aware of, there is all this discussion about the rights of nature. So several of the environmentalists I mentioned before, and also in some cases, also national legislation in some countries in Latin America are starting talking about the rights of nature. I won't talk about the case of Latin America now, and I don't refer mainly to that because it's quite different from the other. But the mainstream discourse around that we see, at least in the global north, it's, that some kind of, liberal democratic, right of nature as a person that can defend itself, and you can find many articles online that they are really interesting. If you are or funny, I don't know how to call them, that start talking about, who can represent nature. And people starting, mentioning criteria. We can find good lawyers to do that. We can find good governments to do that. Or, so anyway, having this discussion in mind, me and several other colleagues, we decided that, this is actually part of the depoliticization of the environmental issue. And we should start talking in different terms because it's not helpful. And of course, we draw inspiration from The Right to the City, which I'm sure many of you know, and the very important work of David Harvey, of Lefebvre, of Neil Smith, and the great legacy that exists in urban fights in the city for the right to the city. And we start thinking that actually we should start saying that this goes beyond the city now. These kind of fights against urbanization, against capitalist urbanization, against infrastructure development are actually now expanding everywhere. And we can find, we have a lot of cases around the globe that show that this is the case, and that show actually that now, in the Anthropocene era or the Capitalocene era, as others will say, the urban is not anymore confined within, the limits of the traditional city. And by the urban, I mean here, the built environment and everything that it's constructed. So this is what we had in mind. This is why the book was had this title around the right to nature, and we wanted, by drawing on these movements and these struggles and these scholars, we wanted to expand this discussion and start saying, that even though this is challenging, especially for the Marxist tradition, because in the Marxist tradition, many times environmental movements are considered movements that don't have a revolutionary potential. So we wanted to start and openly say that this is not the case. We want to say that environmental movements can disrupt capitalist accumulation, and they're actually doing that when they stop a pipeline, when they stop mining, when they stop fracking. Yes, they stop capital accumulation. And there are movements that have revolutionary potential. There are movements that have anti-capitalistic elements quite clearly. And we should, try to see in the 21st century, in our era, a way to expand our fights beyond, beyond the factory, beyond the neighborhood, because the previous era was the era that was fighting to expand from the factory to the neighborhood. And now say, we have to go even further and find ways to relate these struggles within and beyond the city, around, radical and alternatives that will be, openly opposing capitalism as completely incompatible with any kind of socio-environmental sustainability and justice. Thank you. I will stop.
Thank you, Elia.